This is Vanessa Gorman. We're going to talk about subordinate clauses in this video, and we'll begin as usual by talking about what they are in English so that you can understand what they are in Greek. So we've already discussed at length independent clauses, which are the main clauses, the thing that makes a sentence. Without an independent clause, you don't have a sentence, you have a fragment. So an independent clause requires a predicative, right? A main verb, a conjugated verb, and all of its necessary arguments and whatever optional satellite elements it might have. And remember that independent clauses have valency, the verbs have valency, and so they have anywhere from 0 to 3 necessary arguments, 0 if it rains, 1 if you have an intransitive verb, so there's only a subject. 2 has a transitive verb that only takes one kind of object. And 3 is a transitive verb that requires 2 objects. So you give something to someone, you send someone somewhere. So 2 or more main clauses can be coordinated. We've seen this plenty of times now. Either one by itself forms a complete sentence, and together, if you coordinate them, you can have coordinated predicatives. So we can have the Persians wintering in Sardis and the Athenians in Miletus. We've seen plenty of that, and they're introduced by words like and, but, yet, or, all of which are coordinators. Now, those are coordinating conjunctions. Now we're going to start talking about subordination. That is, clauses that do not make a proper sentence by themselves. They are dependent on the main clause. So, for example, it's an independent clause if you say Pericles was advising the people. That's a perfectly good independent sentence. But if you say when Pericles was advising the people, you don't have a full sentence, nor after, in order that, because. None of these are independent clauses. They all are subordinated. They're dependent upon some other main clause. And so we call these subordinate clauses, and we call this process subordination. And there are 3 ways of subordinating in Greek that we're going to go through in turn. One is to use an infinitive. We can make a kind of subordinate clause using infinitives. We'll come to in a little bit. Another one is to use participles, which is a cheap and easy way to make a subordinate clause, which we will also come to in a bit. But for now, we're going to talk about proper subordinate clauses introduced by a subordinating conjunction, not a coordinating conjunction. So words like so that, after, because, since, with the result that. These words are normally followed by a conjugated verb. Some of them require an infinitive instead. And the mood that is used after these subordinating conjunctions varies a lot depending on whether you're talking about something that actually happened or whether you're talking about something that's potential. Usually the indicative mood that you know already is used for statements of fact. One thing you have to know is that subordinate clauses can fulfill any role that a nominal can fulfill. So it can be the subject of a sentence. It can be the object of a sentence. It can be the predicate nominative. It easily can be a necessary argument, although it's often an optional argument. So in other words, it can be labeled, the verb of the subordinate clause can be labeled almost any way that a noun could be labeled, and then some. It can also be labeled as an adverb. Now, there are main types of subordinate clauses. Most of these are self-explanatory, and I want to go through them one by one and talk about what they are. But these are the terms I'll be using a lot, and so you should become familiar with them. Temporal clauses are pretty obvious. They have to do with time, right? So any clause that has to do with a time is called a temporal clause. It can be the time when something has happened, or it can be the time after something has happened, or it can be the time subsequent to something happening. So Different temporal clauses include clauses introduced by the subordinating conjunctions when, while, which is to say during, after, when, before, until. So it all depends on the relationship in time between the action of the main verb and the action of the subordinate clause. These are very easy to handle. They're very, very common, and you won't have a lot of problem with them. Likewise, causal clauses, which, as you might expect, are translated because or since. Now, these are nearly always adverbial. You're explaining a purpose. It's not a necessary argument to the verb. So it's simply things like Pericles stopped speaking because the sun was setting, or he paid the ransom for his son since he had no choice, right? So causal clauses are typically translated because and since. You can translate them as, but I always discourage this. I discourage it in English as well because as is used for so many other things. Because or since are very, very clear. So temporal clauses are easy, causal clauses are easy. Purpose clauses, guess what? They express purpose. They're also called final clauses, but I avoid that term because purpose clauses self-explanatory. They answer the reason why and are labeled adverbially usually, and they are usually translated by terms like in order that, so as to, so that. So Pericles delivered the speech in order to convince the demos. His purpose is to convince the demos, right? So again, these are pretty straightforward. It's just giving you a label for things that you know how to do already. Cleon ran quickly so as to be the first one to deliver the good news. His purpose is to be the first one. So those are all straightforward. Object clauses are just that. They serve as the object of verbs. Some verbs, instead of requiring an accusative direct object, require a subordinate clause as the direct object. And that is their argument. And these are usually broken into two main types, what we call verbs of effort, when you have to accomplish something. So he worked in order to finish the plowing. He worked to finish the plowing. This becomes so often used that it becomes a necessary argument. He worked isn't enough. We're trying to finish the argument. He took pains. He took pains for what? You need to finish the argument. And these are done with subordinate clauses sometimes, with certain verbs. Verbs of effort, also verbs of fearing. You are afraid lest his family be killed. He was afraid that the enemy would not be defeated. This is a kind of a negative purpose, except it acts as the object. You fear, and then you have a subordinate clause. Comparison clauses, we've already seen these in a way. I've snuck them in on you in a way. But remember, there's a lot of ways to do comparison. He was so tall as someone else. It's like a genitive of comparison, but it's using an entire clause rather than just one word. So he is faster than Cleon, you could express with the genitive of comparison. But as he ran, so his pursuers ran faster still is a whole clause used for similes quite often. A lot of times the verb is the same as in the main clause and it gets elided, so you have to supply it. Another fairly obvious label is a result clause, how something turns out. And these are normally labeled as adverb, and there's usually a corresponding demonstrative in the main clause. He was so hungry that he gulped down his food without chewing. What we would normally do is hang this whole result clause on the adverb so, because it's a direct result of something. It was such a big boat that it took 2 weeks to load it. So you see, it's the result of something. And these are normally labeled as adverb. There were so many men that they could not be fed at one time. There are clauses called relative clauses, which are often misused. These are the clauses that are translated who or which or that. So the man who killed Ephialtes is still unknown. I admire the author who wrote that book. The sword that he used in battle was broken. The boat which was painted bright blue weighed anchor at noon. These are a separate category that we're going to deal with separately because there are some tricks to them and they're treated differently from other clauses. They're treated essentially as attributes, and we'll talk about this more when we get to them. They get their own special treatment. There are also things that we call substantive clauses, which are clauses that act the part of a noun. It's as simple as that. Certain verbs especially require them, and they might act as the subject of the sentence, they might act as the object. So he rejoiced that his son was still alive. These are a lot like object clauses after verbs of effort and fearing. Certain other verbs, especially emotional verbs, are followed by subordinate clauses as their object. If you have an impersonal verb, it is clear, it is difficult, it is important. The subject of that impersonal verb can be a subordinate clause called a substantive clause, and it will be the verb of that clause will be labeled as the subject. That we will not win is clear, right? It is clear. It doesn't have any element, right? It's the that we will not win is the subject. Clear is the predicate nominative. Also, after verbs of saying, knowing, perceiving, and showing, we see this a lot. He said that. He knew that. He demonstrated that. He saw that, right? It's very, very simple. You just look for that word for that, and off you go. Likewise, indirect speech, as I just said, it's the same type of clause. It's a way of saying something. He said that he was going to Ephesus. What happens is the subordinate clause, although it looks like a main clause, it is subordinated to the saying. He said to go to Ephesus. He asked whether he was going to Ephesus. So it can take the form of a question, a statement, or a command. They're all going to act as the objects. Then we have conditional sentences. These are the famous if-then statements. If is the dependent part of it, the subordinate part of it, and it's called the protasis, pro meaning coming before. The then clause is the independent statement. It's called the apodosis. Often the word then is not expressed. So if Persia invades again, then we will not be able to defend ourselves. If Persia invades again is called the protasis. That is the subordinate clause. So if you see the word if, you've got a subordinate clause and you're looking for a conditional sentence. If it were to rain, I would have to delay my departure. So it's all pretty straightforward. These are the main types of clauses we're going to be talking about with this next few chapters.